I want to remind you of the passage with which I started this lecture series, with a quote from Natan Sharansky's Fear No Evil. And I want to remind you, and this is going to help us understand what's happening in one of these textual examples, when he talks about when he was in prison, that figures like Hamlet, Oedipus, Ulysses, Don Quixote, he had a special spiritual bond with these figures, wrote Sharansky. Their struggles reverberated with my own when he was in prison. Their laughter with mine. They accompanied me through prisons and camps, cells and transports. At some point I began to feel a curious reverse connection. Not only was it important to me how these characters behaved in various circumstances, but it was also important to them, who had been created many centuries ago, to know how I was acting today. And this is the important point in order to understand what's happening in this incredible text called 4th Ezra. Just as they had influenced the conduct of individuals in many lands and over many centuries, so I too, with my decisions and choices, had the power to inspire or disenchant those who had existed in the past. And this is the very end of this passage. The mystical feeling of the interconnection of human souls was forged in the gloomy prison camp world, where our solidarity was the one weapon we had to oppose the world of evil. I started with Psalm 137. How can we sing a song of Zion on foreign land? That's the question that we're trying to respond to after 70, after 536, after the Spanish Inquisition, after the Shoah. This is a question that we continue to ask on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, when we reread the Book of Lamentations and we reread Kinot. These are not just questions that are about antiquity. These are also questions that are about modernity and our own contemporary world. The Jewish community, after the destruction of the Second Temple, responded, and there are many, many ways in which it responded, and in some sense it never stopped responding, not to 586, not to the first destruction, and not to the second destruction. It became, as I've said in earlier weeks, part of the fabric of our radical hope. That's a phrase from Jonathan Lear, right? A radical hope that is a hope that continues but is muted by or compromised by a sense that the destruction was never fully overcome. We remember our past, we imagine and pray and hope for our future as we reconstitute the present. So how does the Sharansky text help us? Okay. So let me tell you the story about this incredible text called 4th Ezra. I'm not going to get into the history of why it's called 4th Ezra, how it connects up with our own Ezra Nehemiah, except to say that it was written by a Jew after 70 who's trying to figure out how to mourn, how to accept the destruction, and how to move forward. Many people have pointed to the connections between 4th Ezra and texts of the past and 4th Ezra and rabbinic texts of the future. Right, so this is a pivotal moment. It's a very important text. Part of the reason why I return to Sharansky's words is as follows. 4th Ezra, when it remembers the texts of the past, doesn't just derive hope in the present, but it transforms our past. That it transforms the Ezra Nehemiah of the past, or the Ezekiel who experiences revelation in Bavel, on the Kavar Canal. That experience is transformed because it's not just about Ezekiel of the past. There's a new figure who's trying to make sense of connecting with God after 70. So you see that the dimension, the reciprocal dimension. So when we think about Moshe in exile and we remember his struggles in the Midbar, or we remember what was tragic about his inability to return to the land, we also transform Moshe. We're not only transformed by the past. How is it possible to sing a song of Zion on foreign soil? And the answer in Psalm 137 is, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. This extraordinary lament is integrated into the response. You cannot sing you can't sing a song of Zion. What you can do is lament as a response to the trauma, and Ezra laments. But all of this is to reconstitute hope after trauma, hope after the second destruction, and to make sense of a world that is without temple. But it can only happen, at least in the narrative of 4th Ezra, after one mourns, accepts loss, and then figures out how to move forward. And that kind of move back and forth, this temporal move, is what Sharansky is writing about. But Sharansky is also capturing the temporal hope of Judaism. That is, we move backwards in order to imagine a future. We talked about this in the first class, that in the space of the present, which is an impossible present, we look backwards in order to imagine a future, and then we can move on again. So in the last 20 minutes or so, I'd like to turn to a more familiar example, and I want to leave you with a more familiar example. And I mentioned this at the very beginning of our sessions. I said I wanted to talk about Purim as diaspora and Pesach as exile. So what about the Haggadah of Pesach? The expectation is, and I'm actually going to quote Marguerite, but there were other people who said similar things to me after the first, when I first introduced Pesach. It's about temple. It's about sacrifice. I don't feel lost. I feel connected to the temple. And part of what I want to say is the experience of Passover, the story of narrative and the story of bringing Pesach home and reconnecting with the past in our own present is part of a radical transformation of Pesach. It's about saving Pesach for people without temple. And that is a radical move which is done in the Mishnah and the Tosefta, the earliest rabbinic texts that retell this story, and that describe the Passover Haggadah, drawing, of course, on the Pentateuchal sources and on other texts that describe, for example, the book of Divrei Hayamim, chronicles what Pesach was and how it was celebrated and how it was remembered. What happened after 70? How was Judaism prepared to respond to a second destruction? So this trauma, dislocation, and destruction hit the communities hard. Remember at the very end of the first class, I talked about Thomas Wolfe's novel, which says, you can't go home again. Not that you can't go home at all, but that you can't go home and expect that everything was to be the way it is before you left. And this is an important point for Pesach. That is, Pesach can't really be recovered, but it can be reconstituted. So we try to imagine ourselves going back in time. Anything from carrying suitcases around the table to trying to identify with people in our own time or in our own recent memory that have suffered slavery or the kind of oppression that we liken to the Egyptian repression of Bnei Israel, of the Israelites. But at the end of the day, the Haggadah is an exilic work, by which I mean it's produced in exile for Jews living in exile. They can be living in Israel, they can be living in Alexandria, they can be living in Manhattan. It's a holiday that comes. Let me ask. Right, what's missing from the Haggadah? There are two important things. People usually mention one. The most obvious piece is. I'm sorry. God is quite present in the Haggadah. Moses is missing. God is there. You know, Moses as the enabler of it all is downplayed, and we teach our children very early on. It's downplayed because you don't want to confuse roles here. It's God who enabled it, God who enabled our past, our present, and our future. But the other thing that is kind of scaled back and only rears its head in very strange ways is the destruction itself, the destruction of the temple itself. We talk about the rabbis in the Beit Midrash, right? We talk about the past. But what about this profound disconnect? And we have the symbolic, it's so symbolic that it's so removed, almost allegorized, that we can't even point to the shank bone and say, that is the Zroa. That's the thing that represents, we shy away from the explicit account that this is about temple. And the question I want to put to you today, is this compensation on the part of Chazal, on the part of the rabbis, or is it innovation? And I kind of want to suggest it's both. They're both compensating for what's missing, but they're also moving forward. So what do I mean by innovation? The same innovation that I spoke about with Sharansky, transforming figures of the past and the present, transforming a figure of Ezra after the destruction of the Second Temple, transforming who Eov was, now asking questions not about the past and kind of the creation and cruelty and trauma, but asking about the second destruction. So Eov himself has changed. The Rachel mevaka al baneha, Rachel crying over her children, is transformed. So our past is transformed in our present. So there's a kind of innovative confidence that the rabbis had with respect to the transformation of Pesach. So first, with respect to compensation. The Seder recovers the experience of liberation from Egypt. One was a stranger from the standpoint of the temple, where one is at home now. You retell the story. V'higara talavincha bayom hahu. You tell the story to your child. It's a mitzvah to tell your children about this transition from not being at home to being at home again. But we don't have the temple. And the sacrifice, what do? The best we can do is to compensate. We say, Bechol dor vador, in every generation. Therefore, we raise our glass. And the ritualized Seder is a kind of channeling of temple life. And I think this is what Marguerite meant when she said, well, we have temple life. We remember sacrificial practices, the re-experiencing of the immediacy of the divine presence. Hence, the importance of Mosaic absence. Divine presence, Mosaic absence. The past was alive, but our present is dead. So we find what life we can by recalling the past. And this, the Sipor, the story, has two forms on the rabbinic model. We recall the humble beginnings and the past, idolatry or enslavement, and then becomings of a past, present, now in worshiping God, or a kind of freedom through temple worship. Okay, so that's the story of compensation. But I want to suggest tonight that there's also a kind of innovation, and this is the kind of bold steps that I've tried to point out, both with Megillat Esther, with the book of Esther and Ezra Nehemiah. Secondly, with Alexandria and Philo of Alexandria, there were bold moves that were made about integration of the Greek into the Hebrew, from the Hebrew into the Greek, that was risk-taking, that rendered us vulnerable, that was an opportunity, but also the rabbis later would also recognize as catastrophe and loss. And here also, the rabbis are taking risks. They're not just compensating for what's lost, but they also innovate. There's chidush. The Seder reenacts the experience of liberation from Mitzrayim, from Egypt, as a way of dealing with not being at home, not having a temple now. The story of Sipur, the story of telling, is now a mitzvah to tell your children about past liberation in order to give them hope for future liberation. And this is the phrase, which I was quoting from Jonathan Lear, of radical hope. It's a radical hope in order to give them for the future and even for the present. That is, we imagine a future and we can even begin to reassemble the pieces, what's left of our present. It becomes a song of every generation, and therefore, but now it's innovation through study, new study practices, new interpretations, new prayers. The Haggadah is a text, folks, that grows like an accordion. I don't know if you know the history of the Haggadah, but pieces have been added after trauma, after history. This even continues in some communities. But the Haggadah, as we know it, is not just a Tannaitic creation. They're pieces that have been added later on in the Gaonic period, for example, hundreds of years after the destruction of the Second Temple. The Song of Songs, the liturgical connectedness with God, or new interpretive prayers that are added in. Even the songs that we make light of are part of the growth and the celebration and the deliberate creation of new that is present in the Haggadah. So I want to take a moment to reflect on kind of the two different models and to see if there are any questions or comments. So the question, so let me pull some of these threads together and reflect a little bit on Purim, which is most imminent for us, right? Can we ever go home is my question. You know, can we sing again is another way of asking it if we asked it in Psalm 137's voice. The stories of Purim, which I talked about in the first week, of translation in the second week, and Passover, are stories really, I'd suggest, about growing up, about accepting and integrating the trauma and trying to figure out how to move forward as individuals and as people. The stories, and here let me use, remember I put on the chart Diaspora and Exile, or Purim and Pesach. The stories are about negotiating a world that is outside of the temple. Diaspora, as Purim is written while a second temple is about to be built, or possibly even edited while it's up and functioning. Or a world really in exile, without a temple. The Haggadah is formalized and written in the absence of temple. And just to go back, for those of you that weren't with us in the first of the three classes, I talked about Purim as diaspora. That is, Purim isn't waiting for a return. Purim figures out how to live in Shushan, in Persia. And that's how it's resolved, with writing and rewriting. Remember, I talked a little bit about the playfulness of writing throughout Megillat Esther, and that's one way in which you can read the Megillah this year. To look at the way in which writing is transformed. Only Achashverosh can write. That's a special gift. By the end, it's Haman. It's only Mordechai and Esther who can write, but it's the right of the king as a kind of God. And at the end, it's again one of the many experiences of transformation and overturning of Nahafochu. So there's trying to figure out how to live in a period of nistar, of hiddenness with respect to Purim, hence Esther, as the rabbis tell us, or without temple and exile. Negotiating that challenge without simply having a myth of restoration. And I don't want to suggest that the myth of that the account of restoration, that is the historical rebuilding of the Second Temple, is a myth, but we daven every day. We pray every day for a restoration, for a hope of return and recovery. And that's certainly what makes the survival of a people and a religious tradition possible. I would say that's even what makes a religious tradition compelling. But how can we think about Pesach and Purim together as a way of helping us move forward? I kind of want to say, if we think of Pesach alone, we might be tempted to read it only in a compensatory way to make up for what's lost. But if we bring the story of Purim into Pesach, we see a kind of innovative way in which we should think about diaspora. Even with a temple or a partial restoration, which is the way the Second Temple was remembered, there's still diasporic religion. That is, after the destruction of the First Temple, we never fully overcame that exile and that destruction. So part of what Purim and Pesach help us with today is how to live a meaningful Jewish life away from home, or even in a home to which you have returned while bringing with you what you've learned from leaving home. And this is the example, of course, of 4th Ezra. How do you live in this space again? How do you return to a home which no longer is your home, all of a sudden it's a place of rubble and destruction? But you have to try to imagine a new future, and the way it's done in Judaism in many texts is to look backwards in order to look forwards, and then you have this the possibility of hope, or the possibility of moving again, or singing again, or praying again, or studying again, or reading again from texts that have to be rewritten or re-revealed, with all of its loss and all of its possibility. And most importantly, and this is something I've tried to emphasize really in all of these classes, including the 3 lectures in October, I want to go back to the concept of chidush, and I want to leave you with some thoughts about the possibility of innovation, and a phrase from the Babylonian Talmud about the book of Esther. There's this beautiful phrase towards the end of the book of Esther about kimu v'kiblu haYehudim, right? That they kimu, they fulfilled, v'kiblu, they accepted upon themselves. And there's a debate in the Babylonian Talmud about the acceptance of the law at Sinai. Did they do it willingly? And I mentioned this Gemara to you very briefly 2 weeks ago. And in that context, the rabbis say, well, Moda Rabba D'Oraita, there's a great excuse. The Jews can say they were terrified and they said yes at the time of Sinai. But at the time of Purim, there was no one holding a gun to their head, or what they talk about is a kind of, if you imagine a huge size funnel kind of held over them, I'll drop it, or I'll, the sense of threat when you've just seen the Red Sea part, the sense of awe. In the book of Esther, there's no sense. There's a moment in chapter 4 when Esther kind of hesitates for a second, and Mordechai says, Revach and Hatzalah, it's going to come from somebody else. You're not going to take care of it, someone else will take care of it. There's a sense you might not see the hand of God, but it's going to happen. It's a moment of nistar. That moment of nistar is also an opportunity for human innovation. That is chidush, stepping forward, being the person who steps forward to make a difference in our own context. It's a big challenge, kimu v'kiblu haYehudim, that they willingly accepted not only, the rabbis tell us, the written Torah, but also the oral Torah. That is that and something more at the time of Esther. This maps on in many ways to various concepts I've been sharing with you over the last few weeks, and it's what Gershom Scholem calls the vitality of Judaism, or the vitality of Scripture. The life force can't just be about compensation or making up for what's lost. It also has to be about imagining something vital, a life force that's moving forward. And that's exactly what the rabbis did with Pesach. And that's part of what they're also capturing, I'd like to suggest, with Kimu Masha Kiblu Kfar, that they took upon themselves what they already accepted at Sinai, but they did this in diaspora, because diaspora ultimately was the future of Judaism. a templeless Judaism, a hope for a full return, but a commitment, a tenacious commitment to sustain oneself and one's own community in the face of the worst kind of trauma and devastation and destruction, and to survive nevertheless. And to sing that song again. Can it be, again, a song of Zion? It can be. But now, for this moment, says Psalm 137, it's the song of the memory of Jerusalem. And then the hope of recovery, the hope of Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, again, the very end of the book of Lamentations, to renew our days as of old. Is that primordial renewal? Is it a Sinaitic renewal? Is it something else? Is it something that will surprise us? What are our challenges and what are our opportunities? And that's also the language that I used last week when I talked about the translation. Could the community in Egypt have survived without a Greek translation? Almost certainly not. But the rabbis are also worried about what was lost in that translation and what's lost also in diaspora. So to be mindful of that, to understand the possibilities of innovation and the compensation to recover the past and to imagine a future. How did Judaism survive, accommodate, but also preserve the distinctiveness, and then move forward again? And the tenacity in here, I mean, one of my heroes is Sharansky, and his account, although it's a political statement about what he did in prison and how he survived creatively, and his examples, by the way, are not all Jewish examples. But the way he describes it, it's a deeply Jewish account of how we imagine our past and then transform our past as we move forward. But this is part of, this is not about rewriting history. This is about a mythic, what I would prefer to call Midrashic. This is a phrase from Michael Fishbane, Midrashic imagination. The way in which Midrash sustains Judaism and then moves it forward. We can talk about interpretive trajectories. We can talk about philosophical trajectories. We could talk about literary trajectories, but it's part of, participating in the world around us, which I also think is part of the gift or the possibility of a Judaism that has been able to survive diasporas in the plural. Anyway, it's been a lot of fun teaching you. I also want to encourage you, again, my email, you can write to me at my Yale email if you have any further questions or you'd like more reading. Okay, and thank you again to Betsy and to Elise Cassie. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.